We are starting next seminar, this time by Kato Van Roey. She will be speaking. She will be making a link or case for the link between enactive and cultural relativity, and how one and the other are connected. Kato is a recent graduate of our university, Whorf, and preparing to start her PhD research project. So Kato, I put the camera on you, and now, yeah, the stage is yours.
Okay. So welcome everyone to my presentation today. Like Martha just explained, I'm going to clarify the connection between enactivism and cultural linguistic relativity a bit. I propose that after it's three main parts, actually. I first will explain cultural and linguistic relativity by explaining Sapir and Whorf's ideas on the matter. Then I will explain enactivism, and then I will compare both with each other. So I propose that after each of these parts, we can ask some questions so that I'm sure everybody understands what we're talking about before going on to the next part. Hello. So very much. So the theory of cultural and linguistic gained a lot of traction in the 1930s and 40s when Sapir, Edward Sapir and Benjamin Whorf proposed their ideas on the interdependency between mind, culture, and language. More specifically, they said that we cannot understand mind without taking social and cultural factors in perspective. So with this idea, they opposed classical representational views on mind and meaning, where meanings are seen as universally shared with people. So according to Sapir and Whorf, meaning was not universal but acquired, and therefore relative to cultural circumstances. And this idea was later called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Then more recently, there's an idea in philosophy of mind, which is gaining a lot of traction lately. And it's called enactivism, and enactivists also challenge the classical representational view on mind by saying that we cannot understand mind just by looking at the brain, but we have to take the body and the environment in account as well. The mind here is in continuous interaction with the world around it, and in this way builds their own frames of significance in doing so. So there's a lot of attention for context in enactivism as well. And this context is not only the physical context, but also the social cultural context, of course. So because both enactivism and cultural and linguistic relativity oppose to this classical representationalism and appeal to context in their attempt to do so, I thought that it would be interesting to compare them to each other. Sorry, I forgot to skip to the next slide. To make the comparison, I asked 4 questions, and of course, each question depends on the answer of the previous question. So I guess that explains enough. So the first question was if we can attune Edward Sapir's and Benjamin Lee Whorf's thinking to modern insights of enactivism. This turned out to be the case. So then I asked if enactivism can also support recent studies and fields investigating the impact of culture and language on cognition. Here I selected a theory of Borghi, which is called What or Words as Social Tools. And then as a field, I selected cultural linguistics because both investigate relativity effects. This turned out to be possible as well. So then I decided that I had to really go into the relation between both, and then I compared the main suppositions of cultural relativity to those of enactivism, which were pretty similar, but some differences were very apparent there as well, to which I will come back, of course, in the end. So then I could answer my last question, which sounds all pretty vague now, but it will become more clear. The Sapir Whorf hypothesis can be contextualized in a long European tradition of thinking, and they actually react against certain ideas that stem from Aristotle and Descartes' thought, among others. Aristotle in English, sorry, for example, proposed that all humans share universal meanings, and that these meanings reside in our minds, and that languages are used to express those meanings, so that it's only the labels that we attach to the meanings to express them that differ, but not the meanings in themselves. Then Descartes, of course, is known for his mind and body dualism and his great emphasis on the brain and a priori knowledge. The relativity hypothesis actually really reacts against those ideas. So the relativity hypothesis can be traced back to Hegel and Humboldt, who first said that there's no universal language of thought or universal meanings in our minds. We actually think in language, and these are our specific languages. And then later on, Boas came, and Boas introduced culture in this dynamic as well. He said we should not only look at the relation between language and thought, but accept culture as well. And Boas is actually pretty important here, because he really made it a point that culture should be understood on their own terms. So he reacted against these cultural evolutionary ideas that all cultures evolve from some form of barbarism to more evolved forms of civilization later on. Boas said that these were really Eurocentric ideas, which we really had to get rid of. So then we come to Edward Sapir, who is a student of Boas. And Edward Sapir emphasized the dynamical interaction between mind, culture, and language. He said that aside from biological behavior, such as feeding ourselves or sleeping, all human behavior is actually culturally patterned or regulated by cultural norms. These norms are cultural because we see that people from similar communities actually exhibit generalized modes of conduct. To understand these generalized modes of conduct of the people of your own community, people need to acquire or internalize habitual modes of understanding, which they share with the members of their culture. Without the internalization of these modes of interpretation, for Sapir, it would be impossible to understand the people around you properly, or to glean the meaning behind their actions or words. Sapir also says that it's because of these habitual modes of understanding that we actually cannot understand people from other cultures properly, because we tend to project our own understandings on their behavior. So if they have similar behavior, we would interpret it according to our rules of interpretation, so to speak. So Sapir sees language as a product of culture, and it indexes cultural norms. That's pretty easily understood, because we speak, and that's it, true language in our culture is transmitted to other people of our culture. Then, importantly, he sees language as a thought enabler. So he believes that people did like communicate somehow, but that language was really a necessary part of the evolution of thought to higher thought, so that higher forms of cognition became possible. Most of all, Sapir emphasized a shared perspective among people of the same culture. So it is because of these shared systems of cultural meanings that people experience intersubjectivity amongst themselves. Then there's Benjamin Lee Whorf, greatly understood as a determinist by a lot of people that read his text, and a student of Edward Sapir. So Benjamin Whorf also thought that language, culture, and mind were dynamically interacting, but he thought language was a more important facet in this relationship, because he saw language as a really robust, meaningful system, and therefore he believed it to be more constraining than culture. So it was a stronger aspect, so to say. So he believed that language, because people speak in language to each other, culture evolves with these interactional processes that people speak to each other, but the innovations in this culture can only slowly influence language back. So that's a way longer process, while this process goes quickly. I don't know how to explain it. So just like Sapir, Whorf believes that language structures thought, but we should not interpret this as saying that language, like that thought really happens in spoken language. So it's not like we're thinking words or so, but it's more like the manipulation of word classes or grammatical structures that are specific to our languages. He believes that meaning is linguistically patterned. So the meaning depends on the situations in which, for example, words are uttered, or in which, he really thinks linguistically in this respect. And also emphasizes habitual modes of interpretation, just like Sapir. Whorf wanted to present an epistemological challenge to the Western sciences, because he said that these habitual modes of thinking, which were linguistically patterned, would cause us to have a narrow vision on what were possible explanations in the sciences. For example, English being a transitive language, and always preferring causal explanations, would maybe look for fictitious entities causing certain things that were not there, because our language actually demands this from us. So that's the way in which he means it. But most of all, why Whorf said this is because he wanted to emphasize that other systems of knowing might have important things to say too, and that this, for example, causality that we emphasize in Western science is not the only way of looking at things happening in the world, right? So here I found a nice picture of Steven Pinker. So the misconception and denunciation of Sapir and Whorf. So my interpretation really brought forth that Sapir and Whorf have been greatly misinterpreted over the years. And I found that this is mostly due to misquotations and oversimplifications of their thought. So misquotations, with this I mean mostly that, for example, one person makes a quote, leaves out a part, and then it is taken over, but the people that re-quote it don't go to look at the context of the first quote, and then all references that were made to social reality, for example, were left out, which made the thought of both Sapir and Whorf seem as if it had nothing to do with cultural behavior, but with all behavior, and not only the social world or social reality, but with the physical world. So Pinker, for example, states that Whorf believes that if a language does not have the word blue, that the people of that language cannot see blue. But Whorf actually said that all people have similar vision, and that even color blindness can only cause minor differences in this respect. So it's really like, I cannot even know where Pinker got this idea from, that Whorf would have said it. But Pinker is a really respected thinker, so a lot of people then denunciate their thought, right? And these kind of misconceptions can be traced back to oversimplification of Sapir and Whorf's thought in the 50s, because as I've explained it to you, you can clearly see that what their thought was about was not a testable hypothesis whatsoever. It was just interesting philosophical and anthropological ideas. But to test this idea, Brown and Lindenberg in the 50s left the cultural aspect out and just said, they believe language influences thought, but thought is too vague as well. So let's make thought cognitive processes, perception maybe. So then language influences perception, and then habitual modes of interpretation, that's really vague as well. Let's make that thought potential. So what can people think? So then suddenly Sapir and Whorf supposedly said that our language decides what we can think, rather than that our language influences how we usually interpret things, right? So that's a really big difference to what they actually said. So this is actually also a kind of summary of what I've just explained. But important here is that so both Sapir and Whorf react against the classical view of the universality of meaning, but that for Sapir, the emphasis is clearly on culture, while Whorf really emphasizes language because he believes it's a more robust system and it's more scientifically, like we can scientifically investigate language, while it at the time was really difficult to scientifically investigate culture. So, if anybody has questions already, we go to the second part after this.
You were speaking about reducing it and oversimplifying it, saying that languages that don't have blue can't see blue. I think you're speaking about specifically people being able to distinguish between colors depending on whether their language has words for all the different colors. I think there was some experiment in that respect. Has it been tested?
Well, it has been tested. Later on in the dissertation, I also refer to it. But the thing, people can see the differences, all different shades of blue, for example, even though they don't have words for it. But people like Russian, I guess they have more different words to differentiate between types of blue. And they see these differences a little bit faster. Because, of course, like it's logic as well, because your language needs you to differentiate quicker, because if you want to speak of it, you need to think of a different word as well. So
it's like this distinction between percept and concept. Yes, if you have a concept, the percept is like organized very quickly. Yes?
Yeah,
and otherwise, it
depends
if it matters. Yes,
yeah, like you can still see it, but but then
might,
it's also milliseconds, right?
Yeah.
It's not like you're gonna take a minute longer to distinguish it. But yeah.
What is the content structure and how does the change, or where does rules and stuff like define boundaries of cultures, and how what do you do about the culture is not a fixed entity, with the fact that culture always changes, and in that dynamics, how can you be place for culture to change?
So Sapir and Whorf didn't really talk about culture a lot because he thought it was all too vague. But Sapir actually said that culture was transmitted in social interactions. So I guess that leaves space for culture to change over time as well. But he does see it as shared among people. So that's would be a bit of a problematic stance.
Not based on language. Not based on language.
It's not based on language, like they co-evolve, but they're mutually interdependent. So yeah.
I like the sentence you had there, that language indexes culture.
Yeah.
Kind of like it's a nice way of putting it.
Yeah, because they co-evolve, the cultural patterns become ingrained in the language, right? But then again, language changes over time as well and can index new meanings. Yeah. So I go on to the next. Was it an answer to your question?
Yes.
Sorry. Okay. Okay. So then I will quickly situate enactivism. I did not go very deep into cognitivism in my dissertation. I'm not going to do it now. Actually, I only have a very basic understanding of cognitivism myself. Broadly speaking, cognitivism is based on two main concepts, which are representation and computation. Cognition by cognitivists is seen as something that happens in the brain, and the brain is seen as a black box. So this is a white box, but it has the same meaning. This means that the brain in the box theory actually means that the brain has no direct knowledge of what goes on outside of it. So it has to make guesses or predictions about what happens around it. And then sensory input from your eyes or your touch or any kind of senses then meet these predictions, and then they change the predictions. And this is how your brain slowly, supposedly, builds an inner model or representation of the world that lies outside of it. So some people have called a problem that is related to that idea the symbol grounding problem, namely how do these representations or symbols then relate to the world outside of it. It's not really clear if there's no direct link to them. And then for computation, so this is the idea that brains work similar to computers. So you have hardware, which is your brain, also called wetware because it's mushy. And then software, which is the mind or the thought processes that supposedly are found in our brain. So the idea is that we process sensory inputs according to some rules or like, for example, logic in very early ideas of computationalism. And these processes then turn the input into output, and output is understood as action, any sort of action. Voilà. So enactivism reacts against these views. So according to the enactive approach, cognition is embodied action in the environment. So you can see that they really reverse the whole equation. So minds in this respect are not made for thinking, like in cognitivist ideas, but for acting in the world, and thinking is only a later evolving capacity of minds. So there's some core tenets of enactivism. I will try to make it understandable in a brief amount of time, but it's quite a complex theory. So very important is interaction. So the mind, the body, and the environment stand in continuous interaction with one another. And these interactions are always at the same time sense-making processes. So in our interactions, we make sense of the world, and by engaging in these continuous sense-making interactions, we build know-how of how to better and ever more efficiently interact with our environment. We, or organisms more generally, are understood as autopoietic systems. And autopoietic systems are systems that constantly self-construct and self-differentiate. So this self-construction means that and self-differentiation means that they're coupled to their environment. And they constantly need to see what influences of their environment are gonna let in and which they're not gonna let in, and which influences are crucial for their survival and which influences actually impede their survival. So an important concept here as well is adaptation, because they obviously need to adapt to the environment, because what helps them survive can change over time with their evolution. Then the environment changes as well over time. So they constantly adapt to one another. And through this adaptation, they also become structurally coupled, because their ways of acting in the world become dependent on how the environment is, and the environment then also becomes dependent on the organisms that act in it. To make this very clear, you can think of bees that like carry the nectar of plants to other plants, right? And then another, the primordial tension of life is then this need to always re-evaluate our couplings to the environment, because we change, the environment changes, so we are never in a totally stable condition, right? It's always changing. And herein, normativity also plays an important role, because organisms are supposedly governed by biological and social norms, and these actually constrain our sense-making processes. Here too, I have thought of an example to make it more tangible. So for example, for a cat, a biological norm would be that they are carnivores. So in their interactions with the world, when they come upon meat, this meat their biology would constrain the meaning of the meat, that it is food, while if they encounter a carrot, it would not be food for them. So that's easily explained what the normativity is about. And then all this has as purpose to reach and maintain a state of homeostasis. And homeostasis means that they just succeed in keeping a stable internal environment in an ever-changing world. Voilà. So how does enactivism look at sociality? That's important for a comparison, of course. To social interaction is actually conceptualized as organisms or agents, in this case, being coupled to one another, just like our couplings with the environment. But these couplings in the social arena, we call them coordinations rather than couplings. So when two agents coordinate, they actually engage in each other's sense-making processes. So while in the beginning, or just in the previous explanation, I was talking about autonomous sense-making processes with the environment. Two people engage in each other's sense-making processes, and then they can influence each other's sense-making, right? They can, and their own sense-making processes, of course, are also influenced by the social interactional setting. And when two agents are engaged in these kinds of interactions, they're engaged in participatory sense-making processes. And these participatory sense-making processes, then make sure that people come to social understanding. This social understanding, or to heighten or strengthen the social understanding, people engage in languaging activities in their social sense-making processes, or participatory sense-making processes. Languaging is an enactivist idea on language, which is also anti-representational. So it tries to explain language without referring to content. So here, words are no longer seen as objects that convey a meaning that is already present in someone's mind before, but as attentional technologies. And I'm trying to get it straight in my head before I explain it. These attentional technologies, they're used to, sorry, I'm just quickly gonna look at my paper. With attentional technologies, we can actually influence and guide the sense-making processes of other people more efficiently than just by interacting without communication. So we can guide each other's attention, for example. I guess that's where the name comes from. I'm gonna primarily focus on what language does here, because otherwise it's gonna take too long to explain. Because we can then influence each other's sense-making processes more efficiently, we cannot just coordinate, but cooperate with one another. And this cooperation involves then having conversations, and conversations are explained as recursive coordinations, because what I say constrains at the same time what you can say in an answer to me. And this way we build on each other's previous actions. What is important here is that wordings always are learned in social circumstances, right? And these social circumstances are always governed by social norms. And these norms, like you can compare it to Sapir's thought already here, these norms are then also ingrained in the meaning potential of the words. So words do not have a meaning in themselves, but they are governed by norms that were in the situation wherein the word is learned. And this way they constrain possible sense-making processes of other people hearing my utterance of the wording. So then, when we actually can communicate with each other properly, we can cooperate as well, and very efficiently at that. So in these interactional processes, these social interactions can become social acts. Such a social act can be high-fiving, nodding at each other, all these kinds of small things we do all the time. And these social acts sometimes get a more normative character. For example, the example that I give with the nodding, it has a regulative function over other social acts. So if I nod, you know that you're doing well. You'll go on to do what you do. So I can actually guide your behavior with these social acts. So they gain stronger normativity. And these social norms are also called heteronomous norms, to differentiate them from the autonomous or biological norms that we're born with. Over time, these social norms get stabilized in traditions and institutions, and that's how they can like become bigger than the local and current situation, and influence future generations as well. For example, think of writing as such a system that was once invented, but then got stabilized in a system which we now all use all the time, and which we cannot think of language without thinking of letters or so. So it really influences how we come to think of things that first established them. And in doing so, in stabilizing all these norms and institutions, we actually build or construct a cultural niche. This cultural niche then, is wherein we engage in these autonomous sense-making processes all the time as well. So then future generations will encounter the traces of all these social norms and social acts in their environments. They participate in those norms, and then these norms become appropriated and become like a second nature. And that's why enactivists say that culture is like utterly permeates all our cognizing, because all our interactions with the world, especially if you live in a city, are very culturally influenced. Oops, sorry. Okay, so that was the second part on enactivism. If somebody has questions here.
I was just thinking this seems to resemble a lot to imprinting. Imprinting in the sense that, I mean, the way I understand it, it's also that as of the moment you're born, you are raised with certain norms and traditions, and you internalize them. Mm-hmm. It resembles it very much.
Yeah. I guess it would actually, it's kind of an explanation to why imprinting occurs. Mm-hmm. Other questions? No. Nobody on the screen now? Nobody has questions there. Mm-hmm. No. Yeah, I thought there was going to be a lot of questions in this part. Okay. So then we go on to the, I guess, most fun parts. So how do enactivism and cultural and linguistic relativity relate to each other? So first we will compare enactivism with Sapir and Whorf. So Sapir, so first Sapir and enactivism. So as was, I guess, is clear from my explanations, Sapir's view on culture and enactivist view on culture is already really similar. Both see culture as enacted in social situations, as ways of interpreting the world around us, etc. But of course, Sapir mostly talks about cultural patterns and cultural meanings, while enactivists would talk about cultural norms and cultural normativity. But this is not really a problem. Sapir also sees habitual modes of interpretation as a form of adaptation to your cultural environment, just like an activist would say that the participation in cultural, in the traces of the cultural norms is an adaptation to your cultural niche. But what is different though about between Sapir and enactivists in general is that Sapir says that you need to have tacit knowledge of the cultural meanings that lie behind people's actions and behavior, right? Because according to enactivists, there is no meaning necessarily behind my behavior. The meaning is continuously created in my interactions with the world. But this can easily be explained, like enactivists would not say that there's tacit knowledge behind that we need to understand others, but that we need know how to interact with others to understand their cultural behaviors. Then both Sapir and enactivists think that language and culture co-evolve. They're codependent on each other, just like language is needed for the far-reaching cooperation that is needed to construct cultural niches. Sapir also thinks that language is needed for the transmission of culture and so on. But we do see in this tacit knowledge like a hint of Sapir's idea about meaning, content, and representation in the mind, because knowledge is seen as something that resides in your brain still by Sapir. Then if we look at Whorf and enactivism, so one thing that Whorf and enactivism have in common with one another is the same thing as Sapir and enactivism have in common with one another, is their idea that language and culture shape one another, and that this also has an influence on minds, of course. And also that language may structure certain forms of thought. This is, an activist would not say this is as far-reaching as Whorf sometimes seem to think. But as I explained with the question about the blues, language can influence your cognizing in such a way that you would notice certain things quicker if you have other vocabulary to your disposal. So voila. But enactivists would not agree that language has the upper hand in this relation, because they really emphasize the equiprimordiality of all aspects in all interactions. So language, culture, mind, body, environment all play like an equally important role in every interaction. Also, enactivists would not agree with Whorf's idea that there is a new language of thought, so not the universal language of thought, but the specific language of thought. And activists actually do away with this need of a language of thought to relate to the world, because we stand already in relation to the world. We don't need a language of thought to do so. Furthermore, meaning does not depend on linguistic context, according to enactivists. Meaning is, you could, I see you nodding. Of course, meaning is constrained by norms, but I would not say this really linguistic context. I would say it's social context. And this is not just the sentence, because for Whorf, he really interpreted context very narrowly here as the words that stand next to it in the sentence, while enactivists do not even really think in words and sentences if they think about language. Then Whorf also believes the world is not inherently meaningful for us. That's why we need to build this language of thought to relate to the world. And enactivists do not agree with this either, because enactivists say that we are coupled to the world, so we do not need to represent our world in our minds in order to understand or what the world is about or to engage with it efficiently. And then the shared systems of meaning would also be a little bit problematic for enactivists, because no meaning can be shared if meaning does not reside in the brain, for one. And meaning can only be coordinated, right? So if we have some forms of normativity, the only thing that can happen to these norms is that we participate in them and that they sort of become like regulated, so that people have like sort of the same idea of what it is about and so on, but it's never really a shared system of interdependent meanings, such as Whorf conceptualized it. So this comparison actually makes clear certain premises that are very different in enactivism and in cultural and linguistic relativity, such as proposed by Sapir and Whorf. Because metaphysically speaking, it is clear that Sapir and Whorf still believe that the world is a pre-given fact that is out there apart from us, such as like the brain in the box theory of cognitivism, and that we need to represent it inside our minds in order to meaningfully interact with this world. But they do not believe that these representations are universal, but relative. So the meanings come from the cultures that we reside in and are not shared among all people. Enactivists, on the other hand, do not think, metaphysically speaking, that the world is out there or outside of us, but that we are structurally coupled to this world. And because we are coupled to it, we do not need to represent it in order to meaningfully interact with it. So therefore, their ontology is non-representational. They do not believe in representations or that they exist. So beside these differences, it's funny that we saw that there's so much overlap in their conceptions of culture. So the issue seems to stem from their, like, if we focus on language, these premises become really clear, but if we focus on culture, we can somehow still make them work together. So that's why I decided that we should still investigate the relationship between enactivism and Sapir and Whorf further. So I decided to go with a recent theory on the grounding of abstract concepts by Borgi, and it's called Words as Social Tools. It is about the grounding of abstract concepts, thus in embodied theories, because while embodied theories have not much of I do not think they have difficulties with explaining the grounding of more concrete concepts. Abstract concepts remain like a point of discussion. Borgi et al. Think that so social interaction is actually crucial for our learning of abstract concepts. So abstract, everybody knows what abstract concepts are. They say that we can see that this is the case because when we look at brain images of the processing of abstract concepts, we see that linguistic and social cognition network. We see that linguistic and social cognition networks are often activated when we process abstract concepts, while we process for concrete concepts such as a water bottle. These would be more visual motor networks that are activated. But interestingly, we also see that the mouth is activated when we process abstract concepts. So this would mean that we like engage in inner speech when we try to process these words. So when we compare what to our enactive view of languaging, we see that there are again some differences, but also similarities. So what still sees meaning as reference, so a word refers to a certain object, and then the meaning resides in the reference of the word to the object, while for enactivists, the meaning is only meaning potential, realized in the interactional process rather than residing in the object of reference. But very interestingly, Watt says that words are tools with which we act upon our social environments and change our social environments as well. And this seems very similar to the words as attentional technologies from the enactive perspective, which will guide each other's sense-making processes. And then this, because what really emphasizes the social interactional processes in which we learn ACs, they maintain that we have to expect relativity effects as well in these abstract concepts, because these social interactional circumstances are always cultural as well. So different cultures might give different meanings to these words. Then, so then I looked at what ACs would be in an active explanation, and I concluded that there also have to be relativity effects in abstract concepts from an enactive perspective, because from an enactive perspective, the meaning potential of words is always constrained by linguistic and heteronomous norms, and these norms are always established in specific situations, and these situations are always culturally permeated. So they would come to the same conclusion. Then, enactivism and cultural linguistics. So cultural linguistics explores cultural conceptualizations, and they conceive of meaning as cultural conceptualization. So they explore cultural meanings actually, and they believe that these conceptualizations are communicated in language, so that people transmit these cultural conceptualizations to one another in their communities through speaking. So what I found here is that cultural linguistics adheres to a code view of language. So the code view of language is the view that language expresses meanings, right? So it transmits meanings that are already there and encodes them and brings them to a hearer who then needs to infer this meaning, while languaging does away with this view of what language is about. Then for meaning, cultural linguistics sees it thus as conceptualization, and an important idea here is semiotics. So they believe that actually objects have meaning in and of themselves, so it's closely linked to this code view of language as well, and we make meaning from those objects. So, for example, a chair always has a meaning for me that I can sit on it, and by looking at the chair, I make this meaning from it that it carries inside of it. While for enactivists, they would not say that the chair is inherently meant for sitting on, but that it is my biology or my body that makes it have the meaning of being to sit on. But for my cat, for example, it is a bed and not the chair. So, voila. But when we looked then at their conception of culture, we saw that those are pretty similar again. So both conceive of culture as normative orders, that people like internalize or appropriate. That's really just a semantic matter, I guess. Both believe that culture is socially enacted and renewed, so that it changes over time because of this interaction with it all the time. It's not a static entity. Then because culture is always enacted and renewed in social situations and in very specific social situations, cultural linguistics thinks that cultural differences are expected to be found in cognition, but that not every member of a culture shows the same amount of cultural difference. Like, culture can demonstrate itself in different ways in different members of a culture. It does not have to be equally shared among all members of a culture. So it is heterogeneously distributed. I actually looked up how I had to pronounce that word. And then, from an enactive perspective, we would come to all these same conclusions, except that enactivists would not say that culture is heterogeneously distributed, but heteronomously coordinated. Because of these participation in the norms, in coordination, participatory sense-making processes, these norms get regulated, right? Rather than shared, because saying that it's heterogeneously distributed presupposes that there's meanings that we share, not totally in our minds. So then there is a difference in how they conceptualize interaction, though, because for cultural linguistics, interaction or effective interaction presupposes the internalization of shared concepts, while for enactivists, effective interaction presupposes the appropriation of relevant cultural norms. So in these last two parts, I found similarities and differences, as was clear. So then I decided that I had to go over the main suppositions of cultural relativity in order to really know if enactivism and cultural relativity were related to each other. I will go over them separately because otherwise it would be a lot. So the first supposition or observation made by cultural relativists would be that there is a significant degree of diversity in norms, values, and beliefs across cultures and historic periods, and this is also called descriptive relativism. Of course, this observation does not constitute a problem from an enactive perspective, because enactivism is a paradigm for assessing and explaining empirical findings. It does not really, it's not going to say that these findings are incorrect. But what is interesting here is that, as we have seen, enactivism would actually predict this diversity to occur because of their supposition that culture is like omnipresent in our ways of cognizing and about the world, or cognizing in the world, better to say. Then there's also an inductive argument to the effect that failures in previous attempts to resolve disagreements that arise from these different diversity in norms, values, and beliefs show that there's no universal criterion for adjudicating between different worldviews. So this was actually one of the most interesting differences, I think, between enactivism and cultural relativism. And this that enactivism actually overcomes this epistemological challenge. So where relativists would say everything is relative, there's no universal truth, we cannot know which knowledge system or which worldview is closer to a truth because there is no one. And activists say like we should do away with this idea of knowledge of things, and we should focus on know-how. So knowledge is always a relational property with our environment, and the only thing that matters is our ever efficiently interacting with this environment. And this new criterion for deciding between different ways of knowing or of know-how is then actually efficiency. So if something helps us better of interacting with certain environmental influences, for example, then this would be a better form of know-how. To give an example, something that helps us take care of our health, for example, may not be, or the same theories that help us with our health, like Western medicine, may not be very efficient in helping us with our fear of dying. So we can, like, through this efficiency criterion, we can have respect for different knowledge systems. We may come to believe that, for example, a belief in God can be justified if it helps us not be afraid of death or handle loss. But this belief in God may not be very efficient in certain other, like if we pray for our cancer to go away, right? But then we see that actually this efficiency criterion leads or may lead to some form of acceptance towards other forms of knowing as well, because we can really just look at how they handle things for us, right? So we, like, one small thing we are not in accord with does not have to lead us to discard the whole system immediately. Then there's also the methodological assumption that behavior and thought carry the imprint of their cultural and social context, such that biology by itself is not sufficient for explaining many of their most important features. Well, this is actually one of the premises of enactivism as well. Enactivism thinks that we should always look at environment and body if we want to explain how the mind and cognition works. It states that culture is utterly, that cognition is utterly permeated by culture. And that this is so because we appropriate these norms and it becomes a second nature of our body. So it would be totally in accord with this assumption. So then we're almost at our conclusion. So for differences, it has now really become clear that enactivism and cultural and linguistic relativity depart from a different metaphysics, ontology, and epistemology, because relativists think the world is out there, while enactivists think that we are coupled to it, so our relation to the world is conceived as totally different. So relativists don't do away with representationalism, but enactivists believe that we do not represent the world in order to meaningfully interact with it. Then there's also the different epistemology. Relativists speak in terms of that still. There's just different knowledge systems, while enactivists conceive of knowledge as know-how, as a relational property. So we see this criterion has become efficiency rather than truth or no truth from a relativist perspective. But at the same time, we have found a lot of similarities as well. So both enactivism and cultural relativity react to this universalist representationalism. Both put a large emphasis on context in their quest to do so. Most of the suppositions with regards to culture were in accordance with each other. And as we have seen, the enactive approach actually easily explains the relativity effects, but also, like, from an enactive perspective, we would expect these relativity effects to occur as well. That's why I concluded that enactivism necessarily entails the acceptance of a form of cultural relativity. That is a cultural relativity that is rid of the representationalist assumptions and also of this uncomfortable consequence that we cannot decide between different things that we know, or that we cannot trust in what we think we know. So that was it. I hope I didn't rattle too much.
Kato, would you say that the other way also holds true, that cultural relativism entails enactive?
No. No, because cultural relativity presupposes the representationalist view of mind. So once we accept representations in enactivism, and it's cultural relativity which presuppose enactivism, then it would no longer be enactivism. So was it a little bit clear? Yes.
Who has comments, questions in the room or on the Zoom? Traditionally,
It's usually me.
Yes.
Okay.
How does, or when you think, how does enactivism look at like the merging of cultures and like defining cultures as well? Like the evolution of it? So like, defining and merging of cultures, does it like have a big influence on the way that like the enactment is thinking about all these processes? Is it like a bad thing or a good thing? Is it like making it more rapidly evolving, or like putting it down? How are they looking at this? That's actually my question. Like, how are the enactments looking at like the, because I can, in like a perfect world, I can see that everything is like they have their culture, we have our culture, but in like modern society, everything like merging together. And for example, people that are bilingual, they have a kind of different personality in Spanish that they have in Dutch, for example, and stuff like that. How do they look at things like that?
So that's actually something that I want to investigate in my PhD, because I do not have a clear-cut answer as to how enactivism would look at the going together of different cultures immediately. If we think of these sense-making processes, I guess they would say that cultures eventually merge by coming together, and the people as well, they partake in each other's sense-making processes. So I guess enactivism would have kind of a very positive answer as to the going together, because they would be able to come to social understanding in their sense-making processes. I guess. I guess this should not really pose a problem for them, but that's what I'm wondering, like, but we are seeing problems. So how then do we explain from an enactive perspective why this causes so much problems? So yeah, so I don't have an answer to that question, like not a satisfactory one yet.
We have someone from the Zoom audience wanting to ask a question. Ulysses?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
A little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, we'll try.
Yeah.
So thank you for your presentation, Kato. It was a pleasure. I haven't had time to read your dissertation. I'm looking forward to doing that. And I'm working, just to give some context, I'm a PhD student working in very similar area as Kato, linguistic relativity and enactivism. And my question has to do with the distinction between linguistic and cultural relativity. Because I don't know what you think about this, but my impression is that people who work in the linguistic relativity field today want to make this distinction because one of the objections that is often made against linguistic relativity is to say that it all reduces to culture. So that it's actually culture that explains why apparently speaking Spanish or speaking Dutch makes a difference to cognition. And they would say language is actually irrelevant. What matters is culture. So they want to say, well, you can isolate language as a distinctive element. So basically, my impression is that those that defend linguistic relativity today, they are not so much of the cultural relativist type, because they do think you have an objective truth, and they think you can avoid some of these conclusions, but they want to make that distinction. I don't know if you find that distinction in Whorf and Sapir, or if you think that they end up being the same thing, linguistic and cultural relativity.
Well, Sapir and Whorf, they never dubbed their own thinking as linguistically relativist. I think it's really only dubbed the linguistic relativity hypothesis after their deaths. So with this simplification by Brown and Lindenberg, and by going only from language to culture, that's how it became linguistic relativity. So Sapir and Whorf themselves would say that they are cultural relativists. So for them, I guess the linguistic relativity affects, and especially for Sapir, but Whorf as well stated some things that mean so much as, if one day we can investigate culture, I'm sure we will see that all this can be traced back to culture. So both of them would see linguistic relativity as a part of cultural relativity.
Thank you.
Then if we take culture as an aspect, which part of it is still culture in a higher level? Let's say what you take as culture, monetary system, or the nucleus of the family as culture. Where do you put the defining factor in which? Because, like you say, monetary system can be also transcontinental culture.
Well, I guess
belief system.
From an enactive perspective, everything in our environments at this point is culturally impregnated, but cultures can share similar aspects. For example, the monetary system would be something that at this point in time, a lot of cultures have come to share with each other. But at the same time, cultures, I guess they just would make different levels of more specific culture. And that's also why they say it is heteronomously coordinated. So a family can have different cultural uses. Maybe a province can be a culture, a country can be a culture, a continent. But they would certainly also say that subcultures form cultures in different nations. So I guess they don't really make a clear divide between what culture is. That makes it, but I guess culture is just a vague concept. So
it's a norm shared by a group more than two in a certain sense.
Yeah.
In a sense, it's a similar word to environment. Yes, so it's an amazing, it does say a lot, yes, but it doesn't say on this level of granularity. So we could say, but do you mean forest or like an ocean? No, environment. So, and in that sense, what is by environment, do we mean just few inches apart, or just the entire the entire ecosystem? Yes,
I think I understood it in the widest sense. Intuitively, culture is just everywhere.
Would you not say that a monetary system is rather a language than a culture? Well, it's just a means of talking to each other. Another means. It's not something. I don't find it very cultural.
When you say it as
I think we use money as a language to talk to each other in monetary terms, and that's it. We don't. It's not. It doesn't define us culturally.
Oh, come on! If you had to pay €100 to come here as a ticket, you would behave differently. If you were paid €1,000 to be here, you would be behaving differently.
No, but that's still a monetary way of looking at things. It's because the number of my bank account goes down, or it doesn't say anything about.
That doesn't
decided, no, like for example, banks are cultural institutions.
Yes.
They're not all like we didn't always have banks to regulate our monetary practices, so I guess it has become a certain language, but it's still a really cultural practice.
It's a normative practice, and not all normative. I mean, all
but cultures are normative practices, so.
Yeah, the fact that it's like not nice, it doesn't make it not culture.
Yeah.
It's just not a nice culture.
I think the basic problem is that we're speaking about many different things which seem somehow related: culture, norms, language, concepts, coordinations. So what we actually need is a kind of a terminology that goes to the core of it. And the terminology that I use is distinctions and rules. We make distinctions, that means we categorize things, and the category can be something for which you have a word, or it can be something which does not necessarily have one word with it, but which is culturally recognized. And then for each of the categories, there are certain rules to apply for them. For example, in the culture, it may be that you have a rule that if you belong to the category of women, then you are supposed to produce children and to work in the house. If you belong to the category of men, then you're supposed to go in the army, etc. It is first these categories, that means the distinctions you made, that means you group things together and you separate them from the rest, and then the rules that apply to each of the categories. I think that is something that you find as well in language as in culture, as generally in cognition. That's how cognition works. Cognition starts by categorizing things, and then by learning that particular categories follow particular rules. That means that they have certain properties, that you treat them in certain ways, that you act on them in certain ways. And what the enactive paradigm says is you want to coordinate these systems of distinctions and rules, because if you mean something different by a woman than what I mean, then in the particular case, then we may not agree about which rule applies, and we may get in conflict. So therefore, what culture or language do is they coordinate so that we all agree about what does woman mean, and what does blue mean, and what does a bank mean, and what does a money mean. So we all agree about what money is, and we agree about what rules apply to money. Money is something that you can exchange for gold, or that you can go to a bank with, etc. So what is really, for me, the core is systems of distinctions, where the system means the rules that connect the different distinctions together. And by looking at that in this more abstract way, I think you can more better integrate as different view, cultural, linguistic, cognitive, enactivist. So I think that is, if I were you for your PhD, I would start from this kind of approach to try to synthesize these different approaches.
Look, to me, when you speak about the society and language in terms of those, like how you describe those rules, conditions and rules, to me, like this is much more representationalist than this enactivist approach to language would suggest. Yes? So, for example, it's And there is actually a very nice book which is called Linguistic Bodies by Ezequiel Di Paolo. If you haven't seen it, it's like if you ask like what an enactivism would make out of like speaking about language and culture, they wrote like this is a bunch of like 3 people, yes, enactivists. That's right. They describe this like how language and culture is actually this environment in which the organism is embedded. Mm-hmm. So it wouldn't go through this representation of the categories. Yes, it's like like I'm kind of like pushing you. Yes, like I'm saying no, don't. Yes, don't. And you are not supposed to touch it. And like 30 years later, you will figure it out that because I'm okay. Maybe you are faster, yes, but because I've been categorized. Yes, but it's like it's not because you have been categorized. You just know you are not supposed to touch it. Yes. So it's like it's about you, and it's about this word, which sounds bad because you just
the category does not need to be explicit. It does not need to be an explicit concept, but the child is being socialized that knows not to do certain things or not to touch certain things. It learns to make distinctions.
Yes, but
these distinctions that need to be the same for the child as for the parent. If the parent makes a number of distinctions between things you should do and things you should not do, and the child makes different distinctions, then the child will be corrected until it makes the same distinctions.
Yeah, but this categorization and so on is already like heuristic to understand it, to analyze this whole thing. Yes, because embeddedness in language and culture is that you are the particular kind of slime mold that is like particularly being pushed in a. And then this word means this to you, yes? So then, like in aggregate, you can analyze it as categories and so on.
Well, I don't see how else you can analyze it. Because no matter what you do, socialization means that you should learn that you should do certain things and not do other things. That means you should make a distinction. And to make a distinction, you should coordinate with your parents and with your teachers, because if you make different distinctions, you will get in trouble. And that's how we learn to coordinate our distinctions. We learn to coordinate between, if you are in this circumstance, then you should do that thing. If you are in front of a red light, you should stop. And you're in front of a green light, you can go. You need to learn to make the distinction between red light and green light. And if you're colorblind or whatever, and you don't make that distinction, then you will be corrected until you learn to make that distinction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also think like the whole difficulty is that most of the words in which we talk about certain things we do cognitively are associated with representationalism, while they need not be representations. So we can talk about categories without presupposing that these categories are also like literally present in our brains, I guess. Like it becomes really difficult to talk about anything cognitive without saying, like speaking in representational terms, because they have modeled their view.
Not necessarily. Most people associate representations with those terms. It's not that these terms in principle implicitly contain these representations, like the word concept or category. You think, if you're a representationalist, you think a category that means a collection of things outside there in the world. But the category is not a collection of things. The category is a way for your brain to distinguish, let's say, something that's a cat from something that's a dog. It's not like the category of cat that means the collection of all the cats that are in the world. No, the cat is the implicit concept you use to say, that's a cat, that's a dog. It's making the distinction that you learn. What the thing is that you're being distinguished, that's a metaphysical question, which here is irrelevant. You need to learn to make the right distinction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've discussed this a bit with Professor Mien in Antwerp as well, and he just says it's really difficult to talk about everything you want to talk about that brains do in non-representational terms, because representationalists have modeled their whole like explanations of what brains do on how we talk about it. So we cannot use these concepts without talking in representational terms because they have already used them for that. So then we need to come up with this whole new vocabulary of concepts, which just makes it pretty obscure, right?
Well, we had the same problem in the previous seminar. The previous seminar was about object ontology, and then about process ontology versus object ontology. And then what the speaker was saying was that one of the problems we have with people who don't believe in process ontology, then they will say, yes, but even when you say that something changes, you say that something changes, so there must be something first. And then she said, yeah, but that's language. In the German languages have always a subject that is a noun, and then the verb comes after the noun. So you tend to assume that the noun must be there first, but yeah, that's just because our languages happens to be based and always requires a noun. Like even if you want to say it rains, you have to say it. There isn't an it that is raining. Raining is purely a process, but you're forced to say it rained, and then an object ontologist would say, yes, but you have to say there is something that is raining. No, there isn't something that is raining. Rain is happening.
Yeah, it's a similar.
And it's the same with language about knowledge. Yeah, in our language about knowledge, there's always a assumption knowledge about something does not mean that the something must be there objectively. But yeah, knowledge is not just inside our brain. Knowledge is about things that are not just in our brain. Yeah.
Vishal wants to speak. Vishal?
Yeah, hi, thank you. Good evening to everyone. I'm Vishal from Delhi, and thank you, Kato, for such an insightful talk. It's the first time I've heard the word enactivism. I never heard about this word earlier, so which is good. More word in my vocabulary. I'm keen to know this difference between know how and know that, and how it leads to tolerance and acceptance, because I see it leading towards compassion and empathy, which means that anybody who is an enactivist also needs to act through a prism of compassion and empathy. And therefore, are you trying maybe?
Vishal, you froze for a moment, but now you are back.
Till where was I audible? Till when was I audible?
You said that we had, so that also non-enactivists would have to look at the world through a prism of compassion.
And then you froze.
Yeah, and if he has to look through prism of compassion, are you trying to achieve a synthesis amongst global cultures to come up with a globally consonant ethical norms? Is that the final aim of enactivism? How does it have any practical value? Of course, it has practical value. And if you could give any example you have thought about using enactivism to solve a real world problem?
Well, I guess, so I will begin from the beginning, your question to differentiate know that and know how. So know that is actually based upon semantic knowledge or propositional knowledge, and also based on the metaphysical and ontological presumption that people or organisms and worlds do not stand in relation to one another, but are two different things. So there's a subject-object dichotomy. Everybody knows what I mean. Know that is so knowledge that is actually not especially related to me as a subject or as a knower. I just know this, which is universal and objective thing that I know about something, while know how actually says that knowing is always a relational property between the knower and the known. The concept of affordances may be enlightening here as well. Like objects in the world or things in the world may have affordances for us, so they don't have intrinsic meaning, but my relation with this or my interactions with it actually make that it becomes meaningful, and then I come to know how I can interact with this thing, but I can never know that it is such and such a way, because it always depends on this relation I have with the object, I guess. So that was the difference between know-how and know-that. So know-that is propositional, know-how is relational. Then why does know-how lead to tolerance? So there was this efficiency criterion. So because know-how presupposes this interaction with the world, we ever more efficiently interact with this world. And we can say that efficient methods or more efficient methods of interaction are more are better for us, right? Or for survival, if you look at it from this perspective, the perspective that enactivism takes a lot in all its explanations, especially autopoietic enactivism. So certain things are better to cope with specific problems, but these problems are very varied. So we could say that other cultures may have better solutions to certain problems than our culture or our system of knowing. So I guess that's how it leads to at least a form of openness to other cultures, because practically speaking, this other criterion, we could say, if we apply it, it would actually demand from us a sort of openness to look at other cultures, to solve other kinds of problems, to solve problems that we have not found a solution to, for example. So I guess that would be like a normative principle that follows from an enactive perspective on knowledge.
And this actually happens all the time. The cultures influence one another. Yes, so like those, like this is how this evolution happens.
Yeah.
Like bringing all sorts of things all the time.
Yeah.
Changing.
Because there was also the question, like, do you think to keep that universal?
I have a super culture. Well, I guess in the end, but I'm not sure, like, if that would be an enactivist thought per se, right? I guess that would just be we empirically establish that this is happening, and enactivism will want to explain why it happens.
I would say it's contradictory with the relativist approach, and also like there's this thing that there is still the problem you have is still pretty personal, and everybody has different problems, which will mean that they will find different solutions or like different know-hows, which will create that different culture or different persons will have different problems, so they will still be different.
No, enactivism doesn't say that everybody has the same cognition, but that for those parts for which they interact, they will try to coordinate. So insofar that your problems require you to collaborate with other people, you will need to coordinate with them about the meanings, about what to do in which circumstance, which distinctions to make, which norms to apply. So in that sense, if globalization means that everybody starts interacting with everybody, that people are not just interacting with the people within their own local region, then you could expect that this coordination process will become much more widespread, and that's something like a universal culture is likely to emerge, I would say.
Yeah, I would say coordination necessarily needs universality.
This depends if you like mean just kind of national cultures, because every organization is a culture, yes, and this like the like integration is kind of counterbalanced by differentiation on this like social level, yes. So it's not just individuals and home organization, but just the fact that we are here, it's a kind of like CLEA seminar culture, yes? And in that sense, they're like, you know, I don't believe that cultures will ever like fuse, because they will be like one soup and just individuals. This level of like cultures and then like kind of nested cultures within cultures, it's an extremely complex system in itself. Yes.
You will have the individual worldview, you might say, and then you will have the worldview of the small group and the worldview of the bigger group and the worldview. And at each level, it will become more abstract. It means there will be less detailed distinctions and less specific norms. But at each level, there probably will be some coordination, which means that there will be some shared distinctions. Like, I think that now in the whole world, we probably can make the distinction between energy and matter. Like, that's something that maybe in some cultures in Africa, they don't yet know exactly what's the difference between energy and matter. But I think most people will now understand that there is something like energy and there's something like matter. And for energy, you need particular processes to produce it. And you can transfer it via electricity and other means. So there are things that become universal. But then, how we heat our particular house, that may be different here from Africa, where the circumstances are very different. So our norms and our culture on how to heat houses may still be very local.
Time to be wrapping up. Yes, it's already after. No, sorry, because we started 5:30. Yeah. 20 minutes. Yeah. Sorry, sorry, true. So who wants to add anything?
Well, I just wondered, like, why are you interested in this subject?
I was wondering that too. Yeah.
I had two intercultural experiences in my life. I went to Croatia for 3 months when I was 13 on EFS, and I also went to Morocco for a year when I was 19. And I guess I was particularly interested in, like, in the beginning of, you have like these stages you go through in intercultural experiences. It's pretty universal. Like in the beginning, you're always very happy to be there, but then there comes a prolonged period of depression where you're just like confronted with all your own presuppositions. You can no longer just simply believe that what you know is the right way of looking at the world, and like it's really difficult. But then, like, when you're nearing the end of your experience, and a lot of times you know that you're going home, for example, or other things, then you start to see like the value of what you have learned and like how your concepts may have like changed, or the meaning you give to things. And I guess I just became really interested in, like, I became very aware of my own culturality and cultural presuppositions and the differences with other cultures, which may be very, very, how do you say it, like, like small, like really small and below the surface, like astute. Okay. So yeah, I just became really interested in the topic because of that. And I also had this feeling like something like, can we come to an understanding at all, right? If I was at like near real depression, like, can I really convert these things? So this made me want to really investigate interculturality, cultural concepts, cultural difference.
Have you tried to learn any of the languages?
Yes, I speak a little bit of Croatian, I speak a little bit of Arab, but not a lot. I mean, the Croatian is better than the Arab.
Very interesting. I'm here as unexpected. 5 years that I'm living here, and I lived in Brussels. I tried to learn French. I learned a lot of French, and then now I'm in Flanders and I'm learning Dutch. And it's so I really love to research. It's really different cultural, but also linguistical differences that come from the even locally from the city that I live. I'm from Brazil, so it's so, like it's a mess in my head, but
yeah, probably.
And my daughter is another thing too. She had my daughter she's 5 now, so she knows Portuguese and she knows our culture, but she can't like talk to people in the city as we talk at homes.
Yeah.
In the school, she learned Dutch, so she behaves in another way. So when she comes home, she speaks differently. Like when she arrives at home, she speaks like in a structure that is in Dutch that I know now because I'm learning Dutch. And I don't try to correct her in Portuguese, but it's funny for me because
she's really combining the languages in her mind.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's so interesting.
I think bilinguality is really interesting as well, and what it does to minds. I did research that a little bit for my bachelor paper as well. Like apparently some people that speak French and English are better in maths when they think in French. No, when they think in English, because French, like with their 99, it just stalls the mathematic thought. So it's really funny because we think like mathematics is a different language, but it's not.
In Dutch, it's not easy to read there because we say
exactly.
Yeah, we also make kind of like psychological assumptions about language. Yes, like it's almost as if it was a person. Yes, that this person is kind of more strict and more kind of precise. And this person is kind of more kind of poetic and so on. Yes, and this and then it would kind of translate to the way we behave in this language. Yes, that we become a little bit like that in this language and a little bit different in this language. So it's like in that sense, it is a culture as well.
Yeah, I recently read that apparently people's self-concept can even change according to the language in which they are questioned. Yeah. So I guess we're here then speaking about like certain East-West distinctions. But so people have a more relational view of themselves when they are asked in Chinese than when they're asked in English. Yeah. Which is really odd. Yeah. Like it actually goes to show that we do not have one personality, right? Or there's no essence of personality. Like there's just roles we play.
We were just having that discussion in the cafe before you started your seminar. Multiple personality syndrome.
Which is totally congruent with this enactivism, embeddedness. Yes, that's kind of you are molded by all those like flux of interactions in a particular environment, and you are a product of those interactions in a sense. Yes, so you enter in a different set of interactions, you become a different product.
Yeah. Like all these things are just to be expected from an enactive point of view.
Yeah. So how you are related to you, like you become. Mm-hmm. So, like for me, I'm Polish, so like the sense of like I do feel a difference in the sense of self in me when I'm using more English and when I'm using more Polish. It's like it's quite clear to me that the difference is kind of English makes you exist more pronouncedly. Yes?
Because it's your academic language.
And no. Like I wouldn't say it's like about it's like professional and private. It's just the structure of the self as being related almost like syntactically with all other things. Yes, like you're more there. Yes, like you. Because it's very the boundary is clear. Yes? Yeah. But it's syntax mostly, I would say. Yeah.
Because there's a very clear structure and regular structure in the language.
Just find yourself like in a particular place or in the sentence, like you run the sentence, basically. Yeah. in Polish you might not even be there, and the sentence holds. So
Yeah,
We can say the sentence without the pronoun.
yeah.
yeah.
I don't know. You can basically have a whole conversation.
There's actually in my dissertation, I use this example, which I still think is really astonishing. So there's like an experiment, and they let people watch a video of a woman breaking a vase, for example. And then the people have to explain what they saw, and these people, they there's a group that speaks English, a group that speaks Japanese, and a group that speaks Spanish, I guess. So then the English people, they say like, a woman passed and she broke the vase, or she stomped off the vase, or so on. While I don't speak Japanese, so I cannot say how they would say it, but while the Japanese people just say the woman passed and the vase fell, right? So they do not have to implicate the woman in the falling of the vase. So then they distract all these people with some other exercises. And then they ask them again, like, what did you see in the video? And all the English-speaking participants remember that the woman dropped the vase, while a lot of the Spanish and Japanese people forgot. They just remember that the vase fell.
Yeah.
But imagine, like, if we go, like, if we spin off this a little bit, imagine in the court, imagine in court a witness. He does not remember who caused the accident. Well, if I'm...
Because it was happening in the room.
It was an accident. Nobody asked me at the time, so I don't remember. So it can have very far-reaching consequences, these, like the forms of your language. So that way I agree with Whorf.
But it says a lot also about the culture, because if you want, the English have to find somebody responsible for the vase falling, and the other ones just think, well, the vase fell, it could also be something else, an earthquake for all of them.
And
or maybe God.
Yeah, whichever.
Here you see this kind of like what is being said about the Western culture being individualistic. It's like things are being brought to like causally to individuals, yes. Whereas in other languages you may have like kind of like you can infer from even the way it's being spoken that some other forces are assumed, like processes or kind of happenings, you know, like. Yeah, okay.
That's the same what I was saying previously about the object ontology versus the process ontology in English especially, but more generally apparently in the Germanic languages, there is a tendency that it should always be a noun, a subject of the sentence that does the thing. So in this case, the woman broke the vase, not the vase fell. So, and I've read Jeremy Lunt in his book compares the appearance of the Western worldview, the rationalism, dualism, scientific worldview, and he puts it in the structure of the Indo-Germanic languages, and he then explains that the Chinese worldview, which is much more holistic, would then also have to do with the fact that they have a different language. That the Indo-Germanic languages would have this kind of mind-body dualism in the sense inbuilt, like there must be an agent that does something. While things can happen more spontaneously, flowingly in Chinese.
And the languages, like the same language, Portuguese from Portugal, Portuguese from Brazil is totally different, as I know from here. So the culture also influences the way we also talk. Like in Brazil, you can say chove, it rains, chove, just verb. In Portugal, está a chover, like it's another way of saying.
Yeah, because it's maybe more of a Western, like it's more related to the north of Europe and our ways of talking. So yeah, I guess our
all the future. So
the
native.
So the culture is really different. So yeah, I guess enactivists would totally agree that culture exerts a large influence on language. Of course, like it governs its use all the time. I agree too.
I read somewhere that one of the African tribes do not have a word for future in their vocabulary. So they have a concept of past and present, but not of future. So
Vishal, you froze again. If you hear us.
He's spoken, he cannot hear.
impact quality.
Meditative.
Future was taken away.
Yeah, you look like frozen in the present.
Yeah.
Be careful what you are speaking about because it might happen.
It has happened.
Yeah.
What did you want to say something about this, or was it just the observation?
Yeah. How does language impact the quality of life within a culture? What kind of words we have, and their impact on overall happiness within a culture. So, with that context, I was saying that African tribe doesn't have a word for future. So, are they less greedy than the rest of us?
But I do not think that because you do not have a concept of culture that you cannot think of culture.
Of future.
A future. Yeah. Sorry. To me, it sounds deterministic, right?
I was just wondering, how do they live their lives then? How we live our life? We live our lives through words, through our thoughts. If we cannot think. If we cannot articulate, then we are less sad. Maybe we are more sadder when we are able to articulate, I think.
But a lot of times, for example, in Amazonian tribes, I guess they found as well that they don't have certain concepts like for numbers, but they do have different counting systems. So I suppose that maybe in these African tribes they don't have a concept for future, but maybe they use like names for seasons or other things because like they need to somehow cope with their environment, so they will have certain cues of interacting with it and also with future circumstances, maybe without explicitly mentioning them, but they could say, come fall, I will harvest my fields, for example. It's a stupid example. Yeah.
Herwig, you want to say something?
No, I was very interested about the future concept, because there are a lot of groups they it's not because you don't have the word future that you cannot live in the future. Also, like Aboriginal groups speak in the terms of when the rain comes, or when that will happen, and when that will happen. The word future does not exist, but that does not mean that they cannot preview on what will happen in a time that is not now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because the word future is already an aggregate, so it's like kind of like an abstract bundling of those events, like when the rain will fall and so on.
They connect. This is what
things that's
actually there are also cultures who have more like circular times rather than like linear time here. Like we use linear time.
While in India, Buddhism,
so it's not people who are more living like season, like
circular.
No, that was the idea I was hinting at as well, but it's nice that you had a good example of it. I do really not believe in the idea that the words we have would somehow constrain our thought potential, because that way, like, we could never evolve. So that would be strange.
I think words are really like tools that make it easier to think about certain things. They don't stop us from thinking if we don't have the right word. Words are very handy as labels to summarize a whole network of interrelated knowledge that we have. Like the example I give in my course is the word restaurants. Very simple word, everybody knows what it means, but then if you start looking, what does a restaurant mean? It's not just a building where you eat, there is a whole set of procedures, there is a menu, there are waiters, there is a cook, there is choosing things from the menu, there is sitting at the table, there's a whole bunch of things all connected to this one concept of restaurant. If you would have to explain that to somebody who had never been to a restaurant, it would take you half an hour to explain everything that you need to know about the restaurant. But with that one word, immediately all that knowledge appears in your mind. So it's this. Words are very useful to summarize complex knowledge that we have. And that's where I suppose languages that have words for certain complex concepts, they may indeed be handier to think about these concepts. Languages that don't have these words.
Also, this, the question if is it possible to perceive something and not have a word, like to kind of have a perception and not have a word? Like obviously it is, because otherwise language would not evolve. Like appearance of new words and new ways of speaking are exactly motivated by the fact that we want to express something that we like see apparent, yes, but we don't have tools for those linguistic tools for it. Yes? And also even our conversation, like all those seminars in that sense are exactly that. We are trying to get at something, and the language we have kind of lands somewhere else. So all this theoretical work can be described as this, like finding different words or different combinations of words to land us at, we have a sense of something, yes, and when we speak, kind of the sense lands somewhere else. Yes, this is something a frequency have, like what we are actually trying to do in those conversations.
I'll add something. I was thinking of the same issue on spiritual experience. Has anybody been able to describe what a spiritual experience is? No. My answer is no. Everybody says it is not this, it is not this, it is not this, it is not that. But what it is, nobody is able to say. I just was wondering, why is it that a spiritual experience doesn't have language which we all can understand? Maybe because spiritual experiences are so unique and different that there cannot be a common binding language. Maybe Francis could throw some light on this.
Francis Hallihan on spiritual experience.
Francis is very scientific, so I'm pushing him at a corner now.
Let's hear it.
Well, we have a word, spiritual experience. We just used it. Some people call it a mystical experience. Some people call it a self-transcendent experience. Of course, the experience itself you can never convey, but I think that actually applies to everything. It's the old idea. We both agree that the color of that blackboard is green, but do we see the same green? Do we have the same experience of green? Yeah. Yes. In the end, yeah, you can never express everything in language. Language is just a highly simplified representation of what's going on in our mind. And as long as we agree more or less, that means we are coordinated in our use of the words, it works. But you should never expect that you can express everything that happened. Like, I made a walk in the woods. Can you ever explain your experience of all the trees you saw and the light that was coming through the trees and the color and all the little flowers and the mushrooms and everything you saw in the wood? Can you ever explain that in words? No, not really. It will always be very simplistic caricature.
Yeah, and I also guess your idea of how we can say what it isn't and not what it is, I guess this applies to a lot of things. Like when we want to explain our identities, we mostly start by saying what we are not, right? we almost never say what we really stand for then in our national identity as Belgians or as Flemish people. We are not like Muslims, or we are not like this, and we are not like that, but they never give an answer to, but what are we then? And I guess this goes for a lot of complex stuff, like it's easier to say what my culture is not than to say what it is.
In Vedas, yeah, they say God is not fire, not earth, not water, cannot be destroyed, cannot be made wet. So, but what it is, there's no answer. What God is, there's no answer. What it is not, yes, you're right. Actually,
so the what is a representation of this view. It assumes that there is a word and there is an object that you can somehow grasp that is behind that word. That's not how it works. It only works with simple things like a chair. I can take this chair, but I can't take a mystical experience, or I can't take democracy, or I can't take love. Can't grasp it in my hand, but I can use a word for it. And that word is a distinction I made. I can say, I know a couple of friends and they have a very loving relationship, but these other friends, they don't love each other at all. I can distinguish the one from the other, but that does not mean that I can say what love is. It's not the thing I can take.
yes. What is material? It's possible to define. What is beyond material, things like love, emotions are difficult to really put to words here.
On that note, I suggest we conclude.
Yes.
So thank you so much, Kato.
Thank you for your interesting questions as well, or remarks.
So we are closing the session. Thanks, everybody.